Hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Well, now there's an old adage that you can make a great image with any lens and any camera, and I think that's a true adage, and that's why we really shouldn't dismiss today's lenses. Today we're looking at really cheap lenses. These are lenses that were really cheap back in the day, in the 60s and the 70s, and they're still really cheap today. These are from really obscure brands. I'd certainly never heard of them. So we're not even talking sort of Hanimex, Chinon, Vivitar. We're not even talking that sort of third-party lens. We're talking another level, another tier below those, certainly in terms of pricing. Quality might be a different thing, but certainly in terms of pricing, these ones sat below the Hanimexes and the Chinons and the Vivitars. These were as cheap as you could get without sacrificing some semblance of engineering quality and optical quality, glass and coatings and so on. These, ladies and gentlemen, are as cheap as vintage lenses get. All right, I suppose I ought to tell you what they are before we go on. So let's just have a brief look at what they actually are. The names are so obscure of these brands that I can't even remember them myself off the top of my head. Two of these lenses were sent in by a long-time viewer and friend of the channel, Lionel Zorzovich. So many thanks, Lionel, for these lenses. You've certainly supplied us with quite a bit of kit lately, so many thanks for that. So here are the lenses. What's this one? Rexagon Auto Multi-Coated f2.8 28 millimeters. So it's a 28 2.8, and that's from Rexagon. I certainly never heard of them. It's got an M42 mount, as all the lenses have today. There it is. What else have we got? Well, we've got this one. This is a Zeniton automatic 35 millimeter f2.8. All right, so this is a nice fast 35 mil. That's a nice little lens, certainly on the face of it. I've never heard of the brand Zeniton. I don't think it's anything to do with the Russian brand Zenit. It's made in Japan. I think this was an entirely separate brand. There is the little fellow. We'll have a closer look shortly. And then the third one is a bit scary. I'll show you why. This is the third one. It's still on its adapter. This is, and I'm not going to hold it too close to my eye, this is the Lumax Gold Star. It's a 135 mil and it's a fast 135. It's an f2.8. And the reason I'm a bit scared of it and I don't want to hold it to my eye is because I think it's probably really radioactive. I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a lot of bronzy, orangey colouring going on there. So I think this one must be a bit of a radiation king. I think there must be all sorts of particles coming out of that one. So it might be the coating, it might be bronzy coating, but it doesn't look like that. It looks like radiation. So I'm going to keep this one at arm's length. Okay, so what are these lenses like to shoot? Well, actually, they're not half bad. Let me just look at my notes. Hold on. Nicer than you'd think, I've written here, and they are actually nicer than you would think. I really didn't think these lenses would be quite as nice as they are. I expected them to be awful. I expected them to be really soft, loads and loads of chromatic aberration, you know, all sorts of flaws, and in the end, not to give a nice image. But actually, shooting them, I was proved wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, these lenses are not perfect, but I've never found a lens that is. You know, you can get Carl Zeiss Jena lenses with minor optical flaws. You can find Leica lenses with minor optical flaws. So the top of the shop vintage lenses themselves are not perfect. None of these vintage optics are perfect. And that includes these. They've all got loads of chromatic aberration. One has got loads and loads and loads of chromatic aberration, and that's the 135mm. The other two also have plenty of chromatic aberration. They'll all flare if you shoot them in sunlight. You've got the sun anywhere in the frame in front of you, they're going to flare to lesser or greater degrees, and you're going to lose contrast, and the whole image is going to wash out. That's a nice image if you want it. That's a nice kind of image if you want it. If you decide that you want that aesthetic, these lenses are good ones to shoot it with, and it can be really nice if you judge it just right and you catch the sun just right before it washes the whole image out. Flaring can be a really nice aesthetic quality, so it's just as well really, because these ones do it a lot. They all swirl, they've all got swirl around their outside edges, and that's where the highlights from point light sources, point light sources in the background, if they're in the center of the shot, they'll be nice and round like this. Is that round? Sort of. If they're near the edge or the corner, there'll be ellipses like this. They'll be cat's eyes, squashed to cat's eyes, and around the shot they just seem to give a sort of an impression of swirling around the edge. I like that effect. Lots of lenses do it. Even some modern lenses do it, but a lot of vintage lenses do it, including the Helios 44. Lots of people like it, some don't. If you don't, well then that's a drawback. If you do, it's a positive. I happen rather to like it. They're all reasonably sharp, wide open, sharper than I expected they would be. So that, in fact, was quite a surprise. I expected these lenses to be really mushy and horrible and soft, but they're not. They're actually quite nice. They're actually quite sharp, wide open, relatively speaking, that is. They're no less sharp than, gosh, a whole load of other vintage lenses wide open. They're no less sharp than a Helios 44, for example, wide open. They have the same degree of sharpness, and they surprise me with how sharp they are. And of course they all get much better if you stop them down. So don't forget, the lens is only soft wide open when you shoot it wide open. If you stop it down a bit, like that, to 5.6 or thereabouts, you're going to get a really, really sharp shot, and you won't be able to tell, at least not very easily, you won't be able to tell an image shot with one of these really cheap lenses at f5.6 or shot with a CZJ Pancola or Flectagon, or even a Leica lens. You stop a lens down to f5.6 and it really behaves itself, and these ones do. They all give a really sharp image if you stop them down a bit to f5.6 or so. So there is no need to have a soft image if you don't want one, if you're shooting these lenses. Now, these are very cheap lenses, but does that mean they are bad? Well, bad's a relative term in the vintage lens lark, is it not? I mean, we shoot these old lenses for their old school look. That's what we shoot them for. We shoot them for a flavour of the film days, a flavour of some sort of nostalgia of images that we've seen, a flavour of image making that's different to the very clinical, precise way that a digital camera and lens will make an image. That's what we shoot these old vintage lenses for. So they've all got flaws, all of them. These lenses, the really, really cheap ones, that is the Rexagons and whatever else they were called, Lone Star and Zeniton, they have flaws, of course, and much more expensive vintage lenses have flaws. CZJ lenses, Pentax lenses, Olympus lenses, Canon lenses, Leica lenses. Yeah, even Leica lenses. They all have optical flaws when you're looking at vintage lenses. Some have more than others, of course, but price and name don't necessarily guarantee technical quality. I know of loads of Nikon vintage lenses. Most of the Nikon vintage lenses I've shot have had really bad chromatic aberration, significantly worse than Olympus, Canon, Konica, you know, the other big names. A fancy brand doesn't always guarantee quality. It really is not guaranteed. These lenses, the ones I'm showing you today, the Rexagon, the Zeniton, and the, I can't remember the name, Lumax, they all are a little soft, wide open, as we've said. So they're softer than more expensive vintage lenses might be, wide open, probably of a similar sort of age. And their contrast is a little lower than some of the more expensive lenses that you might buy. Some of the more expensive vintage lenses, for example, a Konica or a Nikon or a Canon. So they do have those qualities sort of baked in, built in. They are softer, they do have lower contrast, but what if you want that look? Don't forget, when we shoot vintage lenses, we are making aesthetic choices. So if you want that look, if you want a slightly soft look, a slightly lower contrast look, one of these lenses, one of these kinds of very cheap lenses will do it for you. If you shoot these lenses, you will end up with a pretty close approximation of the flavour of shooting very cheap lenses back in the film days. It will give your images those qualities. And we associate that look with things, with places, with times, with events, with the past. So a lens is provoking an emotional response in the viewer of your image. A lens is part of your aesthetic choice. It's part of your, if it sounds pretentious, I apologise, but it's part of your artist's palette. It's part of the way you create. So we really need to be selecting lenses for their look, and we need to be shooting lenses for their look. This is another case of who says what's good and what's bad. Who's making the aesthetic judgment? And I think as artists, it should be us. We should take ownership of these aesthetic judgments, and that's why we need to know what these vintage lenses can do. So we shouldn't dismiss a lens because it's very, very cheap, because it will give us a certain kind of look that no other lens could. There's no other way of getting a look like these lenses make, a look from sort of, you know, consumer level film equipment, than to actually shoot it through one of these lenses. Or at least the best way to make that look is to shoot it. You could probably simulate it in software. There's plenty of software around now that will simulate film looks, but it's by far the better thing to shoot it rather than to, you know, lay a look over an image that you've already shot in editing. I say it's always best to shoot it rather than simulate it. Why? Well, it's authentic. If that matters, it matters to me, and it might matter to you. It's a genuine thing. It's a look that's come from a thing that's from the time whose look we're trying to recreate. So it's a genuine thing, and if that matters, then, you know, it does to me, then there we are. That's an important thing. It looks better. It will always, as an image you shoot, a look that you shoot will always look better than an image that you've edited to look that way. And I have written, I must warn you, I have written next to it looks better, I have written in brackets, that might not be true, because there is a lot of really good editing software around these days that probably can give you a similar look. But if you shoot it first, you know what you've got. You know what you've made. You know the look that you've made and created. If you try and create it later in editing, who's to say you'll be able to do it? Who's to say that the white balance, the contrast, the exposure aren't going to accept the overlay properly, aren't going to accept the look properly, and are going to look odd? You know, always, 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 it's better to shoot than to use software for a look. So that's what I think we should be doing. So here's the first of today's lenses, and this is the Rexagon. As you can see, there's its big front element right at the front there, and you can see greeny, bluey and purpley type coatings on the glass there as I move it around. It's a very nicely made lens, nicely engineered, and if you've used vintage lenses before, its appearance will be very familiar to you. Everything turns nicely. It has some nice quality engineering. Even the aperturing turns pretty nicely, nice and smoothly. It's an M42 screw mount, and it's got this switch here for if you're using it on a film camera, and that's for automatic or manual aperture operation. So there's the little Rexagon, nice little optic. Not sure if I can see a little bit of haze around the edge there. No, I think it's clear enough. Yeah, very nice little optic. Here's the Zeniton. Nothing to do with the old Zenit company. Well, say the old company, I think they're still going, making optical products. There is the Zeniton anyway. So it's very similar looking to the Rexagon, and I would think actually that they were made by the same company, looking at them closely, or maybe not. Actually, I don't know. No, they do look very similar. Actually, I would say that they were probably made by the same company, but who knows? Let me know if you know anything about these old lenses. So there we are, we can see the coatings on that one. I think they're maybe a little bit thinner on this one actually. The Rexagon does have fairly nice coatings, but they seem to be a little bit thinner on this lens. There's the side, again made in Japan. Everything turns nicely and cleanly. Yeah, I'm pretty sure these were made by the same company actually, these two. They even feel the same to operate. And there's the M42 mount on the back there, screw mount. And that will mount on digital mirrorless, of course, or an M42 film camera. Here's the one that I'm scared of. This is the, what was it again? Lumax? Yeah, Lumax Gold Star. And can you see the bronzy colour there? That looks like radioactive elements to me. It looks like yellowing from radiation, but I don't know, it might be coatings. You can't actually see them as coatings on the front of the lens, so I'm guessing that is a proper radiation king. So anyway, there it is. It's a nice body, it turns nicely and cleanly. This is a stop down lens, preset, sorry, not a stop down, it's preset aperture lens. So you select the aperture that you want on this ring at the front, and then you stop it down to that aperture when you're ready to take the shot. So it's, you open it up with this ring to focus, and then when you're ready to shoot, stop down to what you've decided, and bang, take your shot. It's on an adapter at the moment, but it is just an ordinary M42 mount lens, just like the other ones. Nothing special, just a screw thread, and there it is. There's the rear of the lens, again looking very, very radioactive to me. So there we are. One bonus, one benefit of radioactive lenses is that they do give fantastic colours. There is absolutely no denying the power of lanthanum added to optical glass. So I can't stress enough that the whole range of vintage lenses, from really expensive ones to really cheap ones like these, should be considered as tools that we use. These are tools that we use in creating our work, in creating our images. One lens will give a certain look, another lens will give a different kind of look. So these are tools that we're using for creating our aesthetic palette, our image, our range of visual elements. And I think it's really important to understand that. Now, lenses are, of course, judged on their technical elements. However, we shouldn't forget that what's really important here is the image. And I hope that's come across from what I've been saying. So it's the things that we need to be considering, really, once we've selected our lens, once we've incorporated a particular vintage lens for a particular look that we want. The things that we should then be thinking about are the visual elements. Elements like composition, line, form, colour, space, those kinds of artistic, formal elements. That's what's important really to creating an image, as is the moment of time that you select to shoot your image. What one photographer, I forget his name, the street photographer, what's his name, the French guy, he talked about the decisive moment. And that's the thing that we need to feel and practice. So selecting the time that we create an image. Now, on the subject of technical quality, we shouldn't forget that the difference between this Zeniton and a Carl Zeiss Jena or a Leica lens is actually tiny. We're talking really about just the last few tenths of a percent. So the difference between a cheap lens in quality, sorry, that's upside down, and a more expensive lens in quality, like a Leica lens or a CZJ lens, the actual difference is tiny. But the effort needed to bridge that gap, to make one of these really cheap lenses work as nicely as a Leica lens, even though the difference is tiny, the effort needed to bridge that gap is very, very large. And of course, we can't ever achieve a perfect lens, as vintage lenses are testament to. And so that improvement, bridging that gap, becomes exponentially harder to achieve. So don't forget, when we're talking about quality, the gap between a cheap lens and a much more expensive lens is really only very small. Now, some of these very cheap lenses are very nice, and today I've actually discovered, or rather not today, but last week, as I've been shooting these lenses, I've actually discovered that this Zeniton has really nice colours and is pretty sharp wide open. Now, I'm not surprised it's got really nice colours, because I do think it's radioactive. The other lenses, the Rexagon and the Zeniton, well, they behave in a similar way, actually. They're both relatively soft wide open. I mean, you've been looking at images all through this, so you've seen this with your own eyes, but I'll sum it up. They're both relatively soft wide open. They both sharpen up a lot when you stop down. They both can be shot wide open, but the image is a little soft. They've both got some pretty bad chromatic aberration, although they're not quite as bad as the Lumax, and they're both pretty nicely made as well. So I hope I've given you some insight into these very cheap lenses, and I hope I've given you some insight and reminded you, you may well have known it anyway, I'm sure you did actually, but I hope I've been able to, what can I say, to underpin this notion that these lenses are part of our artistic and creative palette, and for that reason we shouldn't dismiss these really, really cheap optics. So I guess that is about it from me for today. Many, many thanks for watching. If you've got this far, particular thanks go to you. Many, many thanks go to subscribers for your support, and many, many thanks go to patrons for your support. If you've enjoyed this show, you might want to chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. And if you think this channel's not doing too bad a job of keeping the old vintage optics alive and the old cameras clicking away, you might want to become a patron over at www.patreon.com/Zenography. But as for me, that's it for now. If you're not doing anything too dreadful, difficult or awkward next week at around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.